Every day, millions of Americans watch their income disappear before the money ever reaches their bank account. Federal income taxes, Social Security, Medicaid, and depending on the state where you live, there may also be state taxes, property taxes, sale taxes, and dozens of smaller taxes and fees. Americans contribute trillions of dollars to the federal government every year. But despite all of that money coming in, the federal government continues to borrow. The national debt continues to rise. Interest on that debt continues to grow. And every year, Americans are told, we need to borrow even more. So naturally, millions of Americans are asking the same question. Where is all of that money going? Is it paying for Social Security, Medicare, national defense, interest on the debt, foreign assistance? Or is there something else happening that Americans never see? Here's what makes that question so important. Even after collecting trillions of dollars in taxes, Washington still has to borrow hundreds of billions and sometimes trillions of dollars just to keep operating. So here's the question. How is it that even possible? Most Americans believe their tax dollars pay the government's bill, but that's only part of the story. In reality, your tax dollars enter one of the largest financial systems in the world. And once you understand how money actually moves through that system, you begin to understand why the government can collect trillions in taxes and still borrow trillions more. By the end of this episode, you'll understand where the money comes from, where does it go, who decides how it's spent, and why the national debt keeps growing. So let's follow the money. Before we look at where the money goes, we need to understand where it comes from. The federal government receives revenue from several different sources, but nearly all of it comes from just a handful of taxes. The largest source is individual tax. That is the federal income tax withheld from your paycheck or directly paid when you file your tax return. The second source is payroll taxes, and these are the taxes collected to support Social Security, Medicare. Employees see them listed on their paycheck as Social Security and Medicare deduction. And in most cases, employees also contribute an equal amount. The federal government also collects corporate income taxes. Businesses pay taxes on their profit, although the amount collected changes year to year depending on the corporate earnings, tax rates, deductions, and economic conditions. Then there are excise taxes, and these are taxes applied to specific products and activities, including fuel, tobacco, alcohol, airline tickets, and certain imported goods. The government also receives revenue from custom duties, estate taxes, fees, fines, and several smaller sources, but the overwhelming majority of federal revenue comes from two places: taxes on individual income and taxes connected to employment. In other words, much of the federal government is funded by the income generated through American workers and businesses. And that sounds straightforward. People earn money, and most Americans assume that's where the story ends, but it doesn't, because collecting the money is only the first step. The much bigger question is, who decides where all of that money goes? And the answer is far more complicated than most people realize. To understand where your tax dollars actually go, we need to first understand how the federal budget is organized. Federal spending is not one single budget. It's divided into three broad categories: mandatory spending, discretionary spending, and interest on the national debt. Mandatory spending is determined by laws that have already been passed, and these programs continue operating as long as people meet the legal requirements to receive benefits. Social Security is a mandatory spending. Medicare is a mandatory spending. Medicaid is a mandatory spending. Certain veteran benefits, income support programs, and federal retirement programs also fall into this category. So this is why mandatory spending grows automatically when more people become eligible, when healthcare costs rise, or when benefits increase with inflation. The second category is discretionary spending. This is a portion of the budget Congress debates and funds through annual appropriations. Discretionary spending includes national defense. It also includes transportation, education, scientific research, federal law enforcement, environmental programs, diplomacy, and the normal operation of government agencies. The word discretionary can be misleading, but it does not mean the spending is unnecessary. It means Congress has more direct control over how much is funded each year. The third category is interest on the national debt. And this is the cost of money the government borrowed in previous years. When the Treasury Department sells Treasury bills, notes, and bonds, the government promises to repay investors with interest. That interest must be paid. It does not fund a new bridge. It does not provide a new Social Security benefit. It does not purchase military equipment. It is a cost of financing spending that already occurred. And the national debt grows. Interest becomes a larger part of the federal budget. But that raises another question. If more of the federal budget is going towards interest, how much money is actually left for everything else? When many Americans think about federal spending, they think about government agencies, political programs, foreign assistance, or wasteful projects highlighted in the news. But that's not where most federal money goes. In fact, most federal spending is concentrated in just a few major areas: Social Security, healthcare benefits and programs, national defense, and interest on the debt. And notice this, in 2026, the government is projected to spend more on interest on the debt than on national defense. Social Security provides retirement, disability, and survivor benefits to tens of millions of Americans. Workers contribute to the system throughout their career through payroll taxes, but Social Security is not simply a personal retirement account with your name attached to it. Most of the money coming into the program is used to pay benefits going out today. The system depends on a continuing flow of contributions from workers and employees. That becomes more difficult when the population gets older. The number of retirees grow and the number of workers supporting each beneficiary decline. In 2000, there were about 3.4 workers for every beneficiary. Today, that number is closer to 2.6. The next major area in healthcare, Medicare, provides health coverage primarily to older Americans and certain people with disability. Medicaid is administered jointly by the federal government and the states and provides coverage to qualifying lower income Americans. Together, Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP provides coverage to well over 100 million Americans. Healthcare spending grows for several reasons. More people become eligible, the population ages, medical treatment becomes more complex, and the cost of delivering healthcare continues to rise. Then there's national defense. Defense spending supports military personnel, operations, equipment, bases, research, intelligence, weapon systems, and a broader national security structure. And notice where the largest share goes. Operations and maintenance is the budget biggest category in the Defense Department in 2026 budget requests. The United States military commitments around the world, but even defense, despite its size and visibility, is only one part of the federal budget. And then we reach the category that does not build anything or provide direct service: interest. The government must pay interest to the investors and institutions holding Treasury securities, and those investors include banks, pension funds, mutual funds, insurance company, foreign governments, the Federal Reserve, businesses, and individual investors. Interest payments are not optional. Failure to make them would mean defaulting on a federal obligation and threatening confidence in the Treasury market. And look at what the CBO is projecting. Net interest costs rise from just over $1 trillion in 2026 to more than $2 trillion by 2036. That means every additional dollar spent on interest is a dollar that cannot be used elsewhere unless taxes rise or the government borrows even more. And this is where the frustration begins. Americans continue paying into the system year after year, but the debt keeps growing. Interest costs keep rising, and at the same time, many Americans feel like they're falling farther behind. Housing costs more, food costs more, health care costs more. These are expenses Americans encounter every month. We are paying more, but it feels like our money is buying less. This is where the budget begins feeding back into itself. The government borrows money, the debt grows, interest costs increase. Those interest costs create additional spending, and if revenue does not rise enough to cover it, the government borrows again. So if trillions of dollars are moving through the federal government every year, who actually decides where all that money goes? A common belief is that the president personally controls federal spending. But the system does not work that way. The president begins the process by submitting a proposed budget to Congress. That proposal outlines the administration's priorities. Congress controls federal appropriations. The House and Senate debate spending, taxes, borrowing, and pass legislations that provide the funding. The president can then sign that legislation into law or veto it. Once the money is appropriated, federal agencies carry out those laws, and the executive branch has the authority to administer that money within the limits Congress established. But here's where the problem becomes more complicated. Every president and every Congress inherits spending decisions made years and sometimes decades earlier. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans benefits, defense commitments, and interest on the debt. So lawmakers can change them, but changing them often means reducing benefits, increasing taxes, cutting programs, or disappointing a politically important group. That is why reducing federal spending is much harder than simply identifying a program someone dislikes. On this table, you can see some of the actions lawmakers can take on the left and the real-world consequences of those decisions on the right. Every spending decision involves a trade-off. The political debate often focuses on discretionary spending. That's the portion lawmakers consider through annual appropriation process. But the long-term fiscal pressure is largely being created by mandatory programs and interest costs. That difference matters because cutting a few agencies or eliminating a handful of programs that generate headlines. But look at where the largest share of federal spending actually go. Social Security alone accounts for nearly a quarter, and the net interest is now the largest, or rather the second largest category shown. But do those cuts actually solve the larger problem? And this brings us to the central question. If Americans pay trillions of dollars in taxes, why does the federal government still need to borrow? And the answer is simple. The government spends more than it collects. The difference between revenue and spending is called the federal budget deficit. A deficit is not the same thing as the national debt. The deficit is the annual shortfall. The national debt is the accumulation of past borrowing. And think about it like this. If the federal government collects $5 trillion in 1 year, but spends $7 trillion, it has a $2 trillion deficit. So to cover that gap, the Treasury Department borrows money. It does this by issuing Treasury securities, and those securities are purchased by investors in the United States and around the world. At the end of the year, that additional borrowing becomes part of the national debt. Then the process begins again the following year. And this is why the government can collect record amount of tax revenue and still increase the debt. Tax revenue may be rising, but if spending is rising faster, the deficit remains. And this also explains why the national debt does not automatically decline when taxes increase. Higher taxes can reduce the deficit, but only if spending does not rise. And by equal or greater amount, the same is true for spending cuts. Lower spending can reduce the deficit, but only if revenue does not fall at the same time, or other spending does not occur elsewhere. So the federal budget is a moving system. Revenue changes with wages, employment, corporate profits, tax laws, and economic growth. Spending changes and demographics, inflation, healthcare costs, interest costs, military commitments, emergencies, and political decisions. The deficit is the result of all of those forces interacting. And under current projections, the federal government is expected to continue running large deficits, even during periods without a major recession or a national emergency. And this is the part we should pay attention to. That tells us the problem is no longer temporarily. It is the commitments of the government are growing faster than the revenue available to support them. And that creates a difficult reality. Americans can pay more in taxes, the government can collect more revenue, and the country can still fall deeper into debt. So if collecting more taxes alone cannot solve the problem, and cutting spending is politically and economically difficult, what eventually has to change? The national debt gets most of the attention, but the size of the debt is only part of the problem, because there's another number that determines how expensive that debt becomes. The interest rate. And this is where the pressure begins to build. Treasury securities eventually mature. And when they do, the government normally issues new securities to replace them. In May 2026, Treasuries did exactly that. It offered $125 billion in new securities, including about $83 billion to refund maturing Treasury notes. If the older debt carried a lower interest rate and a new debt carries a higher rate, the government's costs rise. And as more of the debt is refinanced, those higher costs begin adding up. And that creates a difficult choice. Raise taxes, cut other spending, or borrow even more. But none of those choices is painless. This is how debt begins limiting future choices. And this pressure isn't expected to disappear. The net interest spending has historically peaked at about 3.2% of GDP. But the government's accountability office projects it could approach 9% by 2053. In other words, interest spending is projected to grow faster than the economy itself, because every dollar spent on interest, and so far this fiscal year, interest expense has already reached $1.17 trillion. This is money that cannot be spent somewhere else without taxing more or borrowing more. Interest is the financial consequences of decisions that have already been made. And Americans are paying for those decisions today without receiving a new road, a new school, or government service in return. The money is being spent just to pay for the money we already borrowed. And that brings us to the question we started with. When you pay your taxes, where does your money actually go? But all of that brings us back to the question most Americans probably care about the most. Where does your money actually go? You work, you get paid, and before the money ever reaches your bank account, the federal government has already taken its share: federal income taxes, Social Security, Medicare, paycheck after paycheck, year after year. Americans keep paying into the system, so it is reasonable to ask, where does all that money actually go? Because this is where the frustration begins. Americans are constantly being told that there isn't enough money, that difficult choices have to be made, that programs have to be cut, taxes may have to rise, and the government has to borrow just to keep everything running. But then Americans turn on the news and see billions committed to military operations, foreign assistance, defense contracts, and commitments around the world. For years, Americans have heard promises about ending endless wars, reducing American burdens overseas, and putting Americans first. But Donald Trump made those promises a central part of his political message. So when Americans continue seeing billions committed overseas, while they're being told difficult choices must be made at home, of course they're going to question the priorities. And that raises a very simple question. If Washington doesn't have enough money, why does it always seem to find money when Washington decides something is a priority? But here's where following your income tax dollar gets complicated. Your federal income tax payment isn't normally tracked from your paycheck to one specific government purchase. You can't point to $1 and say, that dollar just bought a missile, that dollar repaired a highway, that dollar paid a government contractor, or that dollar paid someone's Social Security benefits. Most federal revenue enters a much larger financial system used to meet obligations established through laws, appropriations, and commitments made over many years. And there are important exceptions. Payroll taxes are connected to Social Security and Medicaid funds. Certain excise taxes may be dedicated to specific purposes, such as transportation programs. But here's the part that changes the picture. The taxes Washington collects still aren't enough to pay for everything Washington spends. Money enters the Treasury every day, money leaves every day. When income revenue isn't enough to cover the government's scheduled payments, Treasury borrowing fills the gap. Tax revenue and borrowed money operate together. So think about what that means. Americans can pay trillions of dollars into the federal government, and Washington can still spend trillions more than it collected. And for many Americans, this is where the frustration becomes personal. Americans want to feel that they are the priority. They want secure communities, affordable health care, reliable infrastructure, opportunities for their children, and some confidence that the country that they're paying to support is supporting them too. But when billions can be committed overseas, wars continue, government contracts keep growing, and debt keeps climbing, while Americans at home are being told there isn't enough money, it's not difficult to understand the frustration. It can feel like Americans are being asked to pay the bill without being treated like the priority. And that brings us to the question we actually need to answer. How much of this problem is money being sent overseas? How much is funding endless wars, military spending, foreign assistance, government contracts, waste? Because if that's where our money is disappearing, we should be able to see it in the numbers. So how much of your tax money is actually going there? Foreign assistance gets a lot of political attention. Every dollar of government spending should be open to scrutiny. So how much we're actually talking about? Foreign assistance represents relatively small portions of total federal spending. Eliminating it entirely would not solve the long-term budget problem. But that doesn't mean waste isn't real. Hundreds of millions of taxpayers' dollars can be committed to a government contract, and taxpayers still may not get what they paid for. And when that happens, taxpayers have every right to demand answers. Government agencies should be accountable. Contractors should be accountable. Fraud should be investigated. And programs that don't work should be reformed or eliminated. But here's where the numbers change the argument. We can expose waste. We can eliminate programs that don't work. And we should. We saw that effort with Elon Musk and Doge when they went through federal spending, looking for waste, fraud, and improper payments. And some of what they questioned wasn't buried in small programs. It involved some of the biggest areas of federal spending. But even after doing all of that, the math doesn't disappear. Because the biggest pressure on the federal budget isn't hiding in small programs. It's concentrated in the biggest ones. Social Security, health care, defense, interest, and the tax system that generates federal revenue. This is where the difficult choices exist. So actually changing the direction of the debt requires more than finding waste. It means confronting some combination of economic growth, spending reform, tax changes, benefit changes, and lower borrowing costs. And there's no single switch that solves the problem without affecting anyone. And that's exactly why these decisions keep getting pushed down the road. Cutting spending affects somebody. Raising taxes affects somebody. Changing benefits affects somebody. Those consequences are felt today, but the cost of doing nothing gets handed to tomorrow. And postponing the decision does not eliminate the cost. It transfers the cost into the future through additional debt and interest, and eventually somebody has to pay for it. So when Washington keeps postponing these decisions, what does that eventually mean for you? Federal spending may feel distant from everyday life, but the consequences eventually reach your household. They reach you through taxes, through interest rates, through inflation, through government benefits, through employment, and through the value of money itself. When the government borrows a lot, it means more treasury securities have to be sold, and somebody has to buy them. And that borrowing doesn't stay in Washington. It can affect interest rates and what it costs the rest of us to borrow money. And look at where yields are today. And keep in mind, treasury yields help influence mortgage rates, corporate borrowing costs, auto loans, and the evaluation of financial assets. So a borrowing decision made in Washington can eventually affect what borrowing costs you at home, and when more and more of the federal budget has to go towards paying interest, there's less money available for everything else. And lawmakers have less flexibility to respond to recessions, wars, natural disasters, and other emergencies. When taxes rise, families and businesses have less money to work with. When benefits are reduced, millions of Americans may need to adjust their retirement and health care plans. Either way, those decisions don't stay in Washington, and if policymakers continue borrowing without dealing with the underlying problem, that pressure keeps building inside the financial system. So the question becomes, where does that pressure eventually show up? Now, that does not mean that the United States is about to run out of money. We're not talking about that. The United States issues debt in its own currency. The dollar remains central to global finance, and the treasury market remains one of the most important financial markets in the world. But here's the thing. Washington still needs investors willing to buy that debt. And as the amount of debt grows, the question becomes, what will investors demand in return to keep buying it? And just because Washington can keep borrowing doesn't mean there aren't consequences. At some point, every system runs into constraints. Remember Rome? It didn't fall because of one single problem. Pressure built over time. For the federal government, those constraints can show up in different ways. Higher interest costs, less confidence from investors, political fights over spending, higher taxes, spending cuts, inflation, or some combination of all of them. And that's usually how things happen, not all at once, but a little change that keeps adding up until one day things look very different from where they started. So how do you know when that pressure is actually starting to build? So how do you determine whether the federal budget is improving or becoming more difficult to manage? I won't be watching headlines. I'll be watching three signals. The first is the federal deficit. Not just because of the amount of debt. Watch how much debt is being added each year. If the economy is growing and the government is still running extreme large deficits, that suggests the imbalance is structural. The second signal is interest expense. Watch how much of the federal budget is being used just to service the debt. As interest takes on a larger share, the government has less flexibility to fund other priorities without raising taxes or borrowing more. The third signal is demand for treasury securities. The federal government depends on investors being willing to purchase its debts, banks, pension funds, money market funds, insurance companies, foreign governments, the Federal Reserve, and increasingly new financial networks that may use treasury securities to support digital dollars and stablecoins. That connects directly to what we discussed in previous two episodes. In episode 13, we examined who may purchase American growing debt. And in episode 14, we examine the financial rails that move money through the economy. This episode brings those two systems together. Taxes provide part of the government's funding, treasury markets provide the rest, and the financial network moves the money between household, businesses, banks, investors, and the federal government. The tax system does not operate separately from the debt system, and the debt system does not operate separately from the monetary system. They are all connected, and those are the three signals I'll be watching, because if the pressure on the federal budget continues to build, those are some of the places we'll see it first. Where do your federal tax dollars really go? How much of the money supports programs Americans use and depend on? Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, national defense, veterans benefits, transportation, research, law enforcement, and the normal operation of the federal government. But an increasing amount also goes toward something less visible: the cost of previous borrowing. That is a part of the system Americans need to understand. The government is not borrowing because taxpayers contribute nothing. It is borrowing because the promises, programs, and obligations of the federal government cost more than the revenue the tax system produces. And until that gap is addressed, the national debt will continue to rise. The question is not whether Americans pay enough taxes. In absolute dollars, Americans already contribute trillions. The question is whether the country's revenue, spending commitments, and economic growth can be brought into alignment, because eventually every financial imbalance creates an adjustment through taxes, through spending, through interest cuts, through interest rates, through inflations, or other changes in the value of money. And the people who will understand the system and see that adjustment forming before it becomes obvious in their bank accounts. If you missed the episode 14, where we broke down the hidden financial network that moves your money, go back and watch that next. It connects directly to what we covered today, because taxes do not simply disappear from your paycheck. They enter a system of government spending, borrowing, treasury markets, interest payments, and financial obligations built over generations. Understanding your tax dollars and where they go means understanding the system they're entering. If you found value in today's investigation, please click the like button. And if you're interested in understanding macro shifts reshaping our financial future, subscribe to Follow the Money USA and share this episode with someone who wants to understand where the financial system is heading next. Because when you understand where the capital is flowing, you can better position yourself for what comes next. And until next time, investigate, navigate, prosper.